The morning was too quiet. No wind, no cracking ice. The kind of stillness that doesn't mean peace, it means something is coming. She stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at the sky to the north. The clouds sat low and yellow-gray, pressed flat against the horizon like a ceiling being lowered. Anyone who had lived through a frontier winter knew exactly what that sky meant. It meant she had hours, maybe less, but she didn't go inside. She grabbed a shovel. Her neighbors had noticed her that morning. A few had paused at the edge of their plots, watching without words. One man leaned against a fence post long enough to shake his head and walk away. What she was doing didn't make sense to anyone watching. Not the shape of it, not the effort, not the timing. Why, on the last calm morning before the worst winter in recent memory, was she packing wet mud against the outside walls of her cabin? It looked like panic. It looked like desperation. It wasn't either of those things. What she was doing that morning had a logic to it. A logic built not from books or formal instruction, but from years of watching, measuring, and listening to what the cold actually did to wood and stone and earth. She had noticed something that the others hadn't. Something about where heat went. Something about what stopped it. The mud was thick and dark, pulled from the creek bank while it was still soft. She worked fast, pressing it into the gaps between the logs, building it up along the base, packing it against the windward wall with flat, deliberate strokes. Layer after layer. To anyone watching, it looked like a waste of a final good day. But when the storm arrived, and it arrived harder than any winter that valley had seen in a generation, only one cabin held its warmth through the night without burning through its entire woodpile. If you want to know what she understood that the others didn't, stay with me. Because what she built into those walls that morning wasn't just mud. It was a system, and it worked. If you've ever wondered whether the old ways actually held up, or whether we've been building wrong for the last 100 years, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the engineering that kept frontier families alive. The winter of 1886 did not arrive gradually in the northern stretches of the Montana Territory. It did not send polite warnings through cooling nights and early frosts. It came the way catastrophe always comes to people who believe they have prepared enough, suddenly, and from a direction no one expected. Local accounts from the settlement near the Judith River Basin describe that season as unlike anything the previous decade had produced. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the first week of January and held there for 11 consecutive days. The wind came from the northwest in sustained gusts that stripped the warmth from any structure not built to withstand it. And most structures in that valley were not built for anything close to what arrived. It was not the first hard winter, but it was the one that clarified, for anyone paying attention, exactly how poorly most frontier cabins were actually designed. The settlers who had arrived in that region through the late 1870s and early 1880s had built quickly because they had to. Speed was survival. A family that spent too long perfecting their cabin was a family that entered winter without a roof. So most of what went up was practical in the immediate sense. Log stacked, chinking packed with whatever was on hand, a central hearth or a simple iron stove positioned roughly in the middle of the floor. It kept people alive. In mild winters, it was enough. But mild winters were not the standard. They were the exception. The previous winter, 1885, had already delivered a warning. Oral accounts gathered by a local Methodist minister, whose records are still held by a historical society in Lewistown, describe at least 4 families in the valley burning through their entire season's woodpile before February. 2 households abandoned their cabins entirely and moved in with neighbors. One family lost half their livestock to cold that seeped through the base of an uninsulated barn floor. These were not failures of effort. These were failures of design. What the settlers of that region had brought with them from the eastern states and from Europe were building traditions developed for different climates, different materials, and different winters. The techniques that kept a family warm in Ohio or in the Rhineland assumed certain things about wind patterns, about available timber, about soil composition. Those assumptions did not hold in the northern high plains. The cold, there was a different animal, drier, faster, and far more aggressive at finding the weak points in a wall. Some settlers understood this instinctively. A handful had arrived in the territory with knowledge borrowed from indigenous communities, an understanding that the earth itself was a thermal resource, that mass and burial in soil could do things that stacked wood alone could not. But that knowledge was not widely shared. It was not written down in the manuals that circulated through frontier communities. And in many cases, the people who held it were not being listened to. Into this landscape, this geography of cold that was already claiming its lessons in wood and hunger and sleepless nights, came the winter of 1886. And it came for everything. The families who survived it intact were the ones who had, in one way or another, stopped building the way they had been taught and started building the way the land demanded. One of them was a woman working alone on a 30-acre plot 2 miles east of the river bend. Her name was Marin, and the morning before the storm arrived, she was standing at the creek bank with a shovel, loading wet mud into a wooden cart. To understand what Marin was doing that morning, you first have to understand what everyone else was doing and why it wasn't working. The standard frontier cabin of the 1870s and 1880s in the northern plains followed a logic that made sense on the surface. You cut logs, stacked them, chinked the gaps with mud and grass, and positioned a cast iron stove near the center of the floor. You stored your wood outside under a lean-to and hoped you had cut enough. Most settlers planned for 3 to 4 cords of firewood per winter, roughly 384 cubic feet of split, stacked wood. In an average winter, that was sufficient. In a hard winter, it was not close to enough. The core problem was thermal mass, or rather, the almost complete absence of it. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb heat, hold it, and release it slowly over time. Stone has it. Dense earth has it. Thick clay has it in abundance. But stacked logs, while good insulators in the sense of slowing conduction, have relatively low thermal mass compared to masonry or earthen materials. A log wall absorbs heat from the fire and then loses it relatively quickly once the fire dies down. In a cabin with thin walls and no thermal buffer between the interior and the outside air, temperatures could drop 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 30 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 to 3 hours of the last log being added to the fire. This meant that staying warm through a frontier night required constant fire tending. Someone had to wake every 2 to 3 hours to add wood. Over a long winter, this was not just exhausting, it was dangerous. A family that ran short on wood in January, with 2 months of cold still ahead, faced a narrowing set of choices, none of them good. But the problem ran deeper than the walls themselves. Most frontier cabins were built with their base logs sitting directly on the ground, or on a shallow foundation of flat stones that did little to interrupt the transfer of cold from the frozen earth into the floor. Cold ground pulls heat downward continuously, regardless of how well the walls are constructed. Local oral accounts describe settlers waking to find water frozen solid in cups left on the floor, even with a fire burning and the room temperature near 50 degrees Fahrenheit at shoulder height. The cold wasn't coming through the walls. It was coming up through the ground. The placement of the hearth, or stove, compounded the issue. Conventional wisdom positioned the heat source at the center of the room or against an interior wall, which maximized the feeling of warmth in the immediate vicinity. But it also meant that the heat was radiating away from the walls, that the coldest surfaces in the cabin, the exterior log walls, were receiving the least direct thermal input. Heat rose to the ceiling, pooled there, and was lost through the roof before it had a chance to warm the structure itself. What these cabins were doing, in engineering terms, was heating the air, not the building. Heating air is wasteful. Air holds very little thermal energy relative to its volume. It cools rapidly when the fire drops. It stratifies, sitting hot near the ceiling and cold near the floor. And it escapes constantly through every gap, crack, and joint in a timber structure, carrying its warmth with it. A properly designed thermal system heats the mass. It stores energy in the walls, the floor, the hearths around, materials dense enough to hold heat for 6, 8, 10 hours after the fire dies down. Indigenous builders across the northern plains and subarctic understood this principle intuitively. The earth lodges of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, with their thick earthen roofs and semi-subterranean floors, maintained interior temperatures dramatically more stable than any comparable timber structure. A well-built earth lodge could hold heat for 12 to 16 hours without any active fire, a performance that no standard frontier cabin of the era could come close to matching. Marin had seen an earth lodge. She had spent time with a Metis family to the north during her second winter in the territory, and she had slept in a structure that felt, inexplicably to her at the time, warmer than anything her neighbors had built with twice the lumber. She had asked questions. She had listened, and she had come home with an idea that took her 3 years to fully work out. The idea was not complicated, but it required a willingness to do something that most of her neighbors considered irrational. It required burying the cabin. Marin Holstead had arrived in the Judith River Basin in the autumn of 1881 at the age of 31 with her husband Ezra and their 2 children. She was originally from the coastal region of western Norway, a place where cold was familiar but wet, where stone and turf construction had been practiced for generations. The Norwegian concept of the torvtak, the turf roof, was not abstract to her. She had grown up under one. But the cold of coastal Norway and the cold of central Montana were not the same cold. What she encountered on the frontier was a dry, penetrating freeze that moved faster and stripped warmth from exposed surfaces with a speed she had never experienced. Temperature swings were violent. A mild November afternoon could be followed within 18 hours by a hard freeze dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The soil froze deeper, faster, and held its cold longer than any ground she had built on before. Ezra died in the spring of 1884 of pneumonia that had developed slowly through the preceding winter. The cabins in the region had been cold in the way that wears a body down. Not the acute cold that kills quickly, but the chronic cold that weakens the lungs over months of inadequate rest. Marin buried her husband in May and then spent the following summer doing something her neighbors thought was grief-driven eccentricity. She measured things. She walked the valley and noted which cabins were warmest before the morning fire was restarted. She asked which families burned through there first. She pressed her palm against exterior walls at different hours and noted where the cold came through hardest. She spent time near the river, where the soil ran darker and more clay-rich, observing how it held moisture and swelled differently from the sandy ground near the cabins. By the autumn of 1884, she had a theory. By the summer of 1885, she tested parts of it on her root cellar, packing its outer walls with clay-rich creek mud and observing the temperature stability through the following winter. The results were striking. The root cellar, which had previously fluctuated between 28 degrees Fahrenheit and 42 degrees Fahrenheit through the coldest months, now held steadily between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That narrow range meant the difference between frozen turnips and edible ones, and it told her the mud was doing exactly what she suspected. It was storing heat. It was releasing it slowly. It was acting as a thermal buffer between the cold outside and the space inside, absorbing energy when temperatures were higher, giving it back when temperatures dropped. The root cellar was small. The principle she believed would scale. What she planned was not simply better chinking. She intended to pack all 4 exterior walls, from ground to roofline, with a mixture of creek clay and fibrous organic material, dried grass, cattail fluff, and shredded bark, applied in layers and allowed to cure between applications. This composite would deliver 2 properties working together. The clay would provide thermal mass, density enough to absorb and release heat slowly. The fiber would provide tensile strength, preventing the clay from cracking through freeze-thaw cycles. The target thickness was 8 to 10 inches on the windward north wall and 6 to 8 inches on the remaining 3 sides. At those dimensions, the composite would add an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of thermal mass to the cabin's exterior, mass that would absorb warmth during the day and release it slowly through the night. She had spent the summer of 1885 locating the best clay deposit on the creek bank, upriver from the sandy shallows, where the soil ran dark and almost blue-gray when wet. She mixed test batches and watched how they cured, adjusting the ratio of fiber to clay until she had a composite that neither cracked on drying nor softened back to mud when it rained. By September of 1885, she had everything she needed except one thing: time. The first hard frost came 3 weeks early. By the time her materials were fully prepared, the temperature was already dropping fast enough to prevent proper curing between layers. She made it halfway up the north wall before the ground froze and the mud stopped adhering cleanly. She spent that winter in a cabin that was better than before, but not what she had intended. She made notes. She watched where the partial application held the heat and where the unfinished sections still bled it. She measured. She calculated what a full application would have changed. When the snow melted in the spring of 1886, she started again. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, the way one woman turned observation into engineering, subscribe and hit the bell. The next part is where it gets measurable. By May of 1886, the snow had retreated far enough up the hillsides that the creek bank was soft again. Marin was already there before sunrise, testing the clay with her hands the way a baker tests dough, pressing her thumb into it, watching how it held the impression, feeling for the point where it was dense enough to bind but still wet enough to work. She had spent the winter refining her formula. The previous autumn had taught her the core rule: cure slowly. Applied too thick in a single pass, the surface would skin over, trap moisture, and split when it froze. The new approach was layers no thicker than 1.5 inches at a time, each one brought to a leather-hard state before the next went on. The fiber ratio had also changed, 4 parts clay to 1 part fiber by volume, a denser mix than before. The fiber came from cattail fluff, shredded cottonwood bark, and short-cut bunchgrass, 3 sources working at different grain orientations to keep the matrix from cracking through freeze-thaw cycles. She began on the north wall, the windward face, working from the base upward in 4-foot sections, pressing the first pass to a depth of 1.5 inches with a wide wooden paddle. Where logs had deep grooves, she packed the mud by hand before smoothing. By the end of the first full day, she had the first pass on the north wall and half the east wall done. Her arms ached from the shoulder down, but the work was sound. Over the following weeks, she established a rhythm: 2 passes per wall per week, weather permitting, each layer checked before the next was applied, pressed for cracks, moistened where needed, left to firm before being built upon. She was adding mass the way a river adds sediment to a bank, 1 thin deposit at a time, each one locked into the one beneath it. The north wall reached 9 inches in the 3rd week of June. The clay composite extended from 6 inches below the base log, packed against the foundation stones and into the soil itself, creating a continuous thermal buffer between frozen ground and cabin floor, all the way to the roofline. The remaining 3 walls followed at 6 to 7 inches. By mid-July, the exterior of the cabin had been transformed. From a distance, it no longer looked like a log structure. It looked like something that had grown from the ground. Dark, dense, and low. Corners rounded. Windows set nearly 8 inches back from the outer face, recessed into the clay, like features pressed into heavy earth. Her neighbors noticed. A few made comments loud enough to carry across fence lines. One man, a farmer named Clifford Rains who had been in the valley since 1878, stopped at her gate in late July and delivered his assessment without being asked. "You know that's on a crack and fall off the first hard freeze," he said. "All that work, gone before Christmas." Marin thanked him for his concern and went back to her paddle. What Rains did not know, what most of her neighbors could not have known, was that the mass she was packing onto those walls was not simply insulation. It was a battery. A clay wall of that thickness absorbs heat from solar radiation during daylight hours. Even in a short winter day, a dark earthen surface accumulates enough radiant energy to raise its internal temperature several degrees above the ambient air. Then, as the night drops, the wall releases that stored energy slowly, inward toward the cabin interior, maintaining a temperature floor that a wood fire alone cannot sustain overnight. The physics are real and measurable. Clay holds between 0.19 and 0.22 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. At roughly 2,400 pounds of added mass on Marin's cabin walls, that translated to a buffer capable of releasing 1,500 to 2,000 BTU over a 10-hour overnight period. The passive equivalent of burning a quarter cord of wood without striking a single match. Rains had no way to calculate any of that. but the winter would calculate it for him. The cold arrived in the first week of November 1886 and did not leave until late March of 1887. What settlers in the region called the hard winter, one of the most severe seasonal events recorded in the northern plains in the late 19th century, began with a deceptive early thaw in October that encouraged ranchers to leave their cattle on open range longer than they should have. Then the temperature dropped, the snow came, and it did not stop. By mid-December, the valley had recorded temperatures below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit on multiple consecutive nights. The wind pushed it lower. Oral accounts describe water freezing in cast iron pots left near active stoves. Livestock losses across the territory were catastrophic. For the families who had not prepared adequate firewood or had built their cabins in the standard fashion of the period, the weeks between December and February were a sustained test of endurance that some did not pass without cost. Clifford Rains burned through his 4-cord woodpile before the end of January. By local account, he was borrowing split wood from his nearest neighbor, a man named Augustine Verlet, by the first week of February. Verlet himself was rationing, cutting his household fire down to twice daily and relying on heavy wool layering and a shared bed between all 5 family members to maintain body heat through the long nights. These were not failures of character. They were failures of the structures around them. Marin's cabin told a different story. She had entered the winter with 3.5 cords of firewood, slightly less than what most of her neighbors had stockpiled. Her stove was a standard cast-iron box model common to frontier households of the period. What she had was the walls. The first indication that something was measurably different came in December, when a neighbor woman named Sybil Hartgrave stopped by on a morning errand and stepped inside without knocking, a common enough habit in frontier communities where cold made indoor stops a necessity. Sybil later described the experience to at least 2 other women in the valley. She said the interior of Marin's cabin felt, on a morning when no fire had been burning for more than 2 hours, like a room that had never gotten cold at all. The numbers, reconstructed from Marin's own notes, a habit she had maintained since Ezra's death, tell a more precise story. On the mornings when she allowed the fire to die completely overnight as a deliberate test, her recorded interior temperature before relighting ranged between 44 degrees Fahrenheit and 49 degrees Fahrenheit. The outdoor temperature on those same mornings ranged between minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit. A differential of 62 degrees Fahrenheit to 73 degrees Fahrenheit, held passively through the night without fire. That was not residual air warmth. Air cools too quickly for that. It was the walls, releasing their stored heat like a slow exhalation. By comparison, accounts Marin gathered from her neighbors, informal conversations she recorded with their permission, suggested that standard frontier cabins in the valley, with fires allowed to die overnight, were reaching interior temperatures of 18 degrees Fahrenheit to 28 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. Several reported ice forming on the interior surface of exterior walls. Most described a consistent 2 to 3 hour window after relighting the stove before the room reached a temperature comfortable enough for children to be out from under blankets. In Marin's cabin, that window was 0. The room was already warm enough to work in before the first log caught. The firewood numbers confirmed what the temperature record suggested. She burned through her first cord between November and early January, a normal rate. Her second cord lasted from January through the end of February. By the time the worst of the hard winter broke in mid-March, she had used 2 3/4 cords total against a season that had pushed most of her neighbors to the edge of their supply and beyond. That represented a reduction of roughly 25 to 30% in fuel consumption against households of comparable size. Not through any modification to her stove or her burning habits, but purely through the thermal performance of the walls surrounding her. If you want to understand why this matters today, why this single woman's experiment on a 30-acre plot in 1886 Montana speaks directly to how we build and heat homes right now, stay with me. Because what happened next was not just about Marin. It was about everyone who watched her get through that winter while they were running out of wood. By the spring of 1887, the hard winter had sorted the valley. Not cruelly, but clearly. The families that had built well were intact and solvent. The ones that had built poorly were diminished. Lighter on livestock, shorter on stored food, carrying the quiet weight of months spent in chronic cold. Clifford Rains, who had declared in July that Marin's walls would crack before Christmas, made the walk to her gate in April. His hat was in his hands. She walked him around the exterior. The walls had developed hairline surface cracks, most less than a 16th of an inch wide, but the structural layers beneath were intact. Nothing had delaminated. The mass was still there, still solid, still locked to the log wall behind it. He asked her to explain it. She did. The clay source, the fiber ratios, the layering process, the curing time between passes. He listened with the particular attention of a man who has been wrong about something specific and knows it. Over the following summer, Rains applied a version of Marin's technique to his own cabin. His mix was heavier on grass fiber than hers. The surface cracking that winter was more significant as a result, but the principle held. His firewood consumption that season, by his own account shared with a local general store owner whose ledger book survived in partial form, was measurably lower than any previous year. Word moved the way it always moves in isolated communities, through necessity and proximity. By the summer of 1888, at least 4 other homesteads in the valley had applied some version of earthen exterior plastering to their log walls. Techniques varied. Some used clay alone, which cracked more but still helped. Some mixed in animal dung as a traditional binder. Some applied only the north wall and reported measurable improvement from even that partial step. None of them would have used the phrase thermal mass, but they measured in cords of wood and degrees of morning warmth, and the mud was doing something the bare logs were not. What Marin had rediscovered, because this was not a new idea, only a forgotten one applied in a new place, was a principle earthen builders had understood for thousands of years. Mass works in both directions. It delays the transfer of temperature across a barrier, whether the outside is hotter or colder than the inside. The ancient adobe builders of the Middle East used it against desert heat. The indigenous earth lodge builders of the northern plains used it against Arctic cold. The Norse used turf. Different climates, different hands, the same logic. What the frontier cabin tradition had lost was time. Time to source better materials, to apply them in layers, to let each layer cure. Marin had taken that time across 2 full summers because she understood something urgency had taught her neighbors to ignore. A cabin that was merely finished was not the same as a cabin that was ready. She lived in that cabin for another 19 years and never once ran short of firewood. In 1891, she packed a 4-inch composite layer beneath the roof shingles, what she described in a letter to her sister in Bergen as teaching the house to hold its breath. The cabin stood until 1931, when a road expansion demolished it. A photograph from that year reportedly showed the exterior walls still intact, dark, low, rounded, looking less like something built and more like something grown. The mud, nearly half a century after she had packed it on with a wooden paddle, remembered its purpose. What Marin understood is not complicated once you see it. A building is not just a container for warmth. It is a participant in it. Not a shell that keeps cold out, but a mass that holds heat in. In a Montana winter at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, that distinction is the difference between a family that wakes up warm and one that does not. We have spent the last century building lighter and thinner, trusting insulation to do what mass used to do. But they are not the same thing. A fiberglass bat stops conduction. It does not store heat, and it does not release it through the long cold hours between midnight and dawn when the fire is low and the walls have nothing left to give. Marin's walls had something left to give. They gave it every night for 19 winters without being asked. The frontier is full of stories like this one. Solutions dismissed as primitive before they were understood, buried under the expansion of roads and decades. But some of them survived, and if we are paying attention, they still have something to teach. If this story changed the way you think about how a building works, or how a winter is survived, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and what you'd build differently. Subscribe if you want to keep going. There are more stories like this one. There always have been.